The sermon text for this morning is found in Psalm 13. That is on page 453 of the Pew Bible, the red or blue Bible that you might find in the seat in front of you, or several seats down from the seat in front of you. Again, that is Psalm 13, page 453. Stand with me as you are able as we honor the reading of God's word. From Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice, because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Now imagine for a moment waking up suddenly, face down on a beach. You can feel the sand beneath you. You can feel the cold ocean waves lapping at your feet. You can taste in your mouth a mixture of salt and sand on your tongue. You can hear waves crashing all about you, and you can hear the sound of seagulls screeching in the distance. But you noticed a distinct lack of human noise. You open your eyes and you roll over and you realize that you are alone on an island in the middle of the ocean. Your bones and your body ache from being tossed about by the sea. Your skin feels like it's been scorched by the sun. You're alone, helpless, and hopeless. You're far from any sort of civilization and far from any sort of help. Now imagine it's the 1700s. And so there are no satellites that are trying to find you. There are no phones, and there will be no mass effort to find you. You realize that you are the lone survivor of a shipwreck and are now left entirely alone on a desert island with no hope for rescue. You are without hope and you're without help. Totally alone. How could you find hope in this hopeless situation? Maybe you recognize this setting from the book Robinson Crusoe. This is the book about somebody who got stranded for 30 years on an island. In this book, Daniel Defoe, the author, describes Robinson's thoughts as he realizes that he is now marooned alone. Robinson says, I cast myself down into the deepest gulf of human misery. I think few would disagree with that statement. It would be absolutely miserable to be marooned and alone. This idea of being left stranded without hope or help is something that is fairly common and reoccurs in literature, in movies, and in TV shows. You can think of other books like Hatchet, of this story of this boy who gets marooned and abandoned alone in the middle of the woods. You can think of the Swiss Family Robinson, where an entire family gets marooned on an island. Or you can think about TV shows that were very popular, like Lost, or the movie Castaway. These things and these stories capture a unique dimension of our souls. We are afraid to be alone. We're afraid to be hopeless in a hopeless circumstance. And now, while most of us have never been stranded on a deserted island and hopefully never will, often we find ourselves in a similar emotional state. Maybe you find yourself alone in a crowded room. Maybe you find yourself so overwhelmed with fears and anxiety that you might as well be stranded on an island. Have you ever felt without hope or help? Have you entered into a dark night of the soul where everything seems dark, everything seems broken, and there seems to be no light or hope to save you? Have you ever felt that maybe God has forsaken you or abandoned you or turned away from you? As we live in this world, we can indeed find that this world is very broken and is full of sorrow and suffering. And the question everyone is asking is, where can we go for hope when we are hopeless? Now, we can find many different answers out there. We can find answers that totally deny hopelessness, saying maybe you're just wrong and you're not actually hopeless. We can find other answers that just encourage distraction. And we can also find hope that encourages us to look in all the wrong places. But it is the Word of God alone where we can find hope when we are helpless. Today we will see that Scripture answers this question of where do we find hope when we are hopeless. Through Psalm 13, we will see today that in times of hopelessness, we can have hope in God because of His steadfast love. Because of God's steadfast love, there is hope when you are hopeless. Through this sermon, we will watch David climb up out of the depth of despair and into heights of confidence and hope in God's love. In this climb, we will see the place for honest confession. We will hear desperate cries for God to act. And finally, we will see the reason for us to have confidence. So if you need a roadmap for where we're going on this journey today, we are going to see a climb out of the depths of the despair through confession, through cries, to confidence in God's love. So we'll begin in looking at this confession. As we begin reading this text, in the first 2 verses, we see David's confession during this long, dark night. In these verses, David is confessing his hopelessness. Now, this specific psalm does not give us in the prescript any sort of information to help us understand what exactly is going on with David. All it says is, this is a psalm to the choir master, a psalm of David. Throughout David's life, there were many different circumstances that left David in a situation where he felt helpless or hopeless. Even though he was called by God and specifically ordained for kingship, he was often in fear for his life. And yes, occasionally, that was by his own doing. And yet in this text, we don't get reasons for why David feels this way. We don't know the circumstances that brought about his suffering. We only see that he does feel this way. Now, it can be really tempting when trials come to run away from the really hard realities that we face. We can be really tempted to keep a stiff upper lip. But emotions are how we engage with God, even the hard and sad and scary ones. God created us with these emotions. And it is these emotions that act as warning signs that tell us something is wrong and tells us that we need to do something. And this is how God engages with us, is primarily through our emotions. The greatest commandment, to love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, is a command to have emotions. And so Psalm 13 reveals to us how we can engage with God in these emotions of hopelessness, helplessness, and despair. These emotions bring us and prompt us to go to God. So in Psalm 13, we don't just see David avoiding these difficult emotions. Instead, he engages with these difficult emotions in order to engage with God. So let's begin by reading these verses. Beginning in verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me. In these first several verses, we see the honest confession of David. John Calvin describes David here as being overwhelmed by a long succession of calamities and multiplied afflictions. David is confessing that his suffering has been long, it has been lonely, and it's legitimate. He cries out 4 different times, "How long, how long, how long, how long?" This shows us that David is not just having a bad night or a really rough weekend. This has been a long, drawn-out season of suffering. Perhaps the seasons have changed and years have come and gone, and there's been no change. For those of us who have children, we know we don't get asked how much longer on a short car ride, right? It's the really, really long ones that we keep getting asked, how much longer? Are we there yet? This is what David is doing. He's crying out to God, how much longer? How much longer must I wallow in this suffering? We see that David is in an extended season of sorrow and suffering. His suffering is long. Have you ever been in a long season of suffering? Have you ever cried out, God, when will this be over? David has. David also says in different ways that his suffering has been lonely. He asks, God, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Mainly, David feels as though God has forsaken him. The fellowship and the intimacy that he expects to feel with God is gone. And now he wonders not just, is God just distant, but has God forgotten him? Or maybe worse, maybe God remembers and God is intentionally hiding from David. Maybe you've struggled with praying like this, feeling like God doesn't listen, feeling like God won't answer. You are not alone. David here is crying out because he hasn't heard. He feels like he's screaming, and he only hears the echo back of his own screams. David here feels worthless, and he wonders, does God care? This seems to be the most significant aspect of David's suffering, the fact that David is experiencing what he feels as a divine absence. He is far experientially from God, and he feels that God is far away from him. He asks, how long must I take counsel in my own soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? David is lonely not just because he feels God's absence, because he feels that he is no one else either. He only has his soul to take counsel with. He doesn't have comforters or fellow sufferers. He only can talk to himself. One thing that I've seen over the years that seems to be true is joys shared are multiplied and sorrows shared are diminished. How true is that when we have reason to be joyful and people to be joyful with, there seems to be more than enough joy going around. But when we are in sorrow and we are together with others, the sorrow seems lessened and more bearable. But here, David doesn't have anybody else. He has no one but his own soul to take counsel with. One writer describes David here as suffering in loneliness that aggravates the anguish. He's suffering in loneliness, and his anguish is all the more aggravated. Have you ever suffered alone? I know I have. And when I have, I can get caught in an emotional feedback loop. Maybe you've had this experience when you start thinking about how horrible things are, and you get thinking through it over and over and over again. And soon, all you can think about is how horrible things are. And you spiral, and your fears start getting out of control. and your fears multiply. David is confessing that he's in this emotional feedback loop. He can only think alone about what is going on, and because of that, he has sorrow all the day. Have you ever experienced sorrow in your heart all the day? Are you currently experiencing sorrow in your heart all the day? I remember a specific time several years ago when my wife and I were walking through some really difficult extended family brokenness. And there didn't seem like there was much else we could talk about. And we'd go through our days talking and feeling the anguish and the pain and the sorrow of brokenness all the day long. And so if you feel this way, you are not alone. God's anointed king of Israel, David, he felt like this. And everyone in this room most likely has also felt this way. We see not only is David suffering long and lonely, it's also legitimate. His enemies are exalted over him. In the book of Joshua in chapter 10, we see a picture of Joshua who has conquered these enemy kings, and they are thrown to the ground, and he and the army commanders step on the necks of the vanquished ones. Here, David feels like that has happened to him. He feels as though he has lost the battle, he has been thrown to the ground, and the enemy is standing on his neck. And his enemy mocks him and asserts his power and victory over him. Have you ever felt that way? So beat up and abused and thrown to the ground by life circumstances that you feel like an enemy has just conquered you. Now, David, as God's anointed, has been promised much, and yet these enemies, who are also God's enemies, seem to be exalted over him. In Genesis 3:15, there is a promise that the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And as we trace the story from Genesis to 1 and 2 Samuel, we see that David is one of these offspring, and we expect him to be triumphing over his enemies, but instead, he is the one being crushed. This is legitimate suffering. David feels hopeless because he has endured through a long season of suffering with no end in sight. And he has endured it alone, with no friends to take counsel with, and he's endured it with an incredible sense that God doesn't care or isn't there. Furthermore, where he's expected to triumph for the sake of God, he is the one that's being defeated. He is the one who's being crushed beneath the feet of the enemy. He feels hopeless because the battle feels like it's been lost. Through these first two verses, we see that David is enduring a long, lonely, and legitimate sorrow. He has reason to feel hopeless. And so, where does he turn? Where does David turn when he is hopeless? David's response is to speak to God. David speaks to God in brutal honesty and with incorrect theology about his experience. Have you ever felt like you can't go to God honestly with the things you're thinking and feeling? Have you been too afraid to admit to God what you think and what you fear? Here, David confesses that he thinks the God who created him, who sustains his every breath, the God who knows everything, the God who cannot forget, has forgotten. He confesses that he thinks the God who has all power and who has promised things will not keep his promises. Sometimes we feel like we can't go to God with our honest thoughts, as if he didn't already know them. In this passage, we see that the best place to begin when we are in the depth of despair is to confess to God where we actually are. When we are in the depths of despair, we need to confess our emotions, our sorrows, our heartaches, our perceived experience, and even our incorrect theology to the God who hears. David confesses his wrong theology and his real thoughts. He says, "How long, O Lord?" You see in in verse 3 that it is an all capital Lord. This is God's covenant name, Yahweh. David is not just screaming out to the void. He is screaming out a name. And he's screaming out the name of the God who says, my name is I am. And so when you find yourself in the dark night of the soul, don't hold in your thoughts and your fears. And don't cry out to a nameless void. Cry out to the God who is. In this honest confession to God, David then moves to cry out to God, asking God to act. So as we move to part 2, we see David's cry to God to act. As we move through this next section in verses 3 through 4, we will see that David moves from confession to God to crying desperately out to God to do something. Verse 3 begins, consider and answer me, O Lord, my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. In this next section, David asks for 3 things. Consider, answer, and light up my eyes. That first word, consider. Some other translations translate it as, look at me. Look at me. David wants God's attention. He is crying out for God to look at him. David's experience of divine absence and his perception of God having turned his face from him has led him to despair. And in his despair, he knows the only solution is for God to look at him. Second, David wants an answer from God. David knows that his only hope is in the words of God. And he finally requests that God would light up his eyes. He contrasts this with death. Bright eyes are very different than dead ones. He knows that his only hope is in the God who sees, the God who speaks, and the God who works. David isn't asking for just a situational change here. He's asking primarily for a change in outlook, a change of vision. The solution that David hopes for is not merely situational, but that he might see God's presence. He wants God to look at him so that he in turn can look and see things differently, correctly. We often in our suffering think that our only hope can be the situational change. That maybe the suffering ends, that person that's causing the trouble goes away, but instead we see ultimately we need is a different vision. David wants, in the midst of his hard circumstance, his heart to see better. He wants his eyes to be lightened up so he can see clearly despite his depth of despair. He wants his perceived experience, the way that he sees what's going on, to change so he can actually see God working in the midst and see the reality of God's presence. He then confesses 3 different fears. Lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. David is trapped in a what-if cycle. He's listing out all the things that he's fearful for. What if I die? What if my enemies win? What if they rejoice over me? Have you ever been so overwhelmed with fear and anxiety that all you can think through is what else could go wrong? Have you ever been trapped in this what-if cycle? David is demonstrating, bringing these fears to God. Now, these are legitimate fears. These are legitimate concerns. Death truly is on the table. He is in fear for his life. And yet he asks for God to lighten his eyes, to help him see clearly. Now, I remember several years ago, I was going through some significant suffering, and I was trapped in a what-if cycle. My wife and I had experienced 2 miscarriages, and I was in a very difficult work situation with a CEO that would scream at us every day. And all these what ifs. What if we can never have kids? What if I'm trapped in this job forever? What if? And I remember going to meet an old college friend at a Applebee's. We were both going through such a season of sorrow and suffering that we called it the seminary of suffering, because everything that could go wrong seemed to be going wrong. And we shared with each other the what ifs. What if this happens? What if this happens? And it was wonderful to share my worst fears with a friend and be comforted. Here, David is crying out to God and sharing with God his what ifs. He is asking the God who feels distant to come near and do something. Now, we might ask, how can David do that? He's asking for something that seems too wonderful that someone could actually ask for. How can David ask such wonderful things of God? Maybe you've asked yourself, how could I ever ask anything like that? Most of us know that David was an incredibly broken man. Yes, he was chosen by God and promised many things, but David still sinned in many, many grievous ways. And so how could such a sinner speak to God and ask that God would look at him and answer? You see, even though we don't know the specifics of David's plight, we do know that God had made a covenant with David. In 2 Samuel 7, God promises to David that we will make through David an eternal kingdom. God connects David to these promises made in Abraham and to that promise made in Genesis 3:15, that the offspring of the serpent, the offspring of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Because of this, David is connected covenantally to God. And so David can ask God to look at him and answer, and to give him a better vision through his suffering. Now, as we begin to speak about the covenant with David and God, we can see where David's confidence comes from. So in part 3, we're going to look at David's confidence in God. As we turn to this final section in verses 5 through 6, we see that God already answers silently, because David has a new vision in these last 2 verses. He says, "But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." David remembers that he has already trusted in God's steadfast love. He remembers his past, that God has already loved him. He remembers that God has been with him this whole time. Throughout all of his life, God has been with David and has loved David. Not because David deserves it, because God is a God of steadfast love. David's confidence does not lie in his own faith. It certainly does not lie in his own righteousness, but instead it relies on God's love. His covenantal love, maybe you've heard this term hesed before. It is the term for God's covenantal love. His steadfast love, his unfailing love. What God has promised, God will fulfill. And when someone has all the power in the world, when he makes a promise, it will be kept. And therefore, David, in the midst of this difficulty, he finds rest and confidence, not in what he's done, not in what he sees, but in who the God he worships is. This leads him to say, "My heart shall rejoice. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." David's circumstances don't change here. But when he remembers that he has a God who loves him, his affections follow. His heart begins to rejoice in the midst of this suffering, and he responds with singing to God, because he remembers that God has dealt with him bountifully already in the past. He reflects on who this God is. This God is a God of steadfast, unwavering love. David is shaken, but he has confidence in someone whose love is never shaken. The answer to David's fear is faith in someone stronger than him. The answer to David's sorrow is joy in who God is, this God who loves relentlessly. This is why David can cry out to God, because though David is not perfect, he is in a covenant relationship with God. And this is why we can cry out to God. Because you see, God was faithful to David. God eventually brought David out of the depths of despair. God did eventually build an eternal kingdom through an offspring of David. 1,000 years after David, Jesus came. And Jesus came and Jesus descended into the pit of despair. Jesus was the one who actually had the Father turn his face away. Jesus actually had all the wrath that David deserves and all the wrath that we deserve poured out on himself. Jesus paid it all. And that we can have a relationship with God. It is because of Jesus and the cross that we can cry out to God like this. Because Jesus has endured the hopelessness of God turning his face away, we can cry out to God and know that God does not turn his face away from us. Because of Jesus, God has a bountiful, steadfast love for us. This is the truth that we must know, and this is the God that we must love. When trials come, we must ask God to lighten our eyes, to clearly see what is before us. And as we wait in hopelessness, we can let our hearts rejoice in the God who is. We can sing because God has dealt bountifully with us in sending Jesus for us. And so in this life, we may never see situational change. And our hope in this life is not for temporal situational change. Our hope is in God and in an eternal kingdom that we will be with him one day forever. Our hope in this life is in a God who will never leave us or forsake us now in the midst of sorrow and suffering. In the midst of hopelessness, we have hope in the God who gives his steadfast love to us. I shared earlier about meeting that friend in Applebee's. And after we shared our what ifs, what he said next has stuck with me. He challenged me to change my what ifs to even if. Instead of worrying about what if such a thing happens, to say even if such a thing happens, God has not changed. God is still God. God still loves me. God is still good. And most preciously, God is with me. Several years ago, I was in another season of suffering, fearing a lot of what ifs, and a song came on the radio that repeated these words to me. Even if my daylight never dawns, even if my breakthrough never comes, even if I'll fight to bring you praise, even if all my dreams fall to the ground, even if I'm lost, I know I'm found, even if my heart will somehow say, hallelujah anyway. Because of the steadfast love of God, we can have hope when we are hopeless. Even if the worst things come, we can have hope in the steadfast love of God. So in conclusion, you can find your hope when you are hopeless by going to God honestly, crying out to him in earnest prayer, and finding your confidence in the character of God. When you are in the blackest night of the soul or in the pit of despair, you can cry out honestly to God. Psalm 13 is a wonderful path of prayer that expresses our legitimate experiences to God, confidently asks God for his presence, and anchors our confidence in who God is. And so when you feel like you are emotionally or spiritually stranded in the middle of an ocean, far away from any source of help, when you are in the darkest night of the soul and you feel like God has turned his face away from you, you have a God who is with you when you suffer, because we have a God who has suffered for us. You have a God who welcomes you to come to him with your most bitter confessions, with your most bitter tears, and you have a God who will brighten your eyes when you cry out to him. Pray with me.